Hello everybody, welcome to the Museum of Danish America for our September Brown Bag Lunch program. We want to thank former board member and Elkhorn native Dennis Andersen as our sponsor for this year's Brown Bag Lunch series. And this month we are very pleased to feature one of our own staff members, still a relative newcomer to our staff. He joined us first part of this year. Adam Bierstedt is the Albert Ravenholt Curator of Danish-American culture. And today he's really presenting some of his own expertise from his academic background about Scandinavian medieval history and the culture that was thriving at that time. So with that, I will invite Adam to tell us about Norse mythology and what it is not.
All right. Thanks very much, Tova, for that introduction, and thank you everyone for being here today. It's an absolute delight to be part of the team. As Tova mentioned, I only joined at the start of this year, so I know this is my first time meeting many of you, but I'm really excited to be able to share some of my own background. To quick introduce that, I have a master's degree in Viking and medieval Norse studies from the University of Iceland and from Aarhus University. So I spent about 2.5 years living in Scandinavia researching exactly this material. So my own research focuses on the Vikings and largely these days how we imagine them. So the ways they've been reinterpreted from their own descendants in the Middle Ages all the way through to today. I also have spoken at several major conferences, including the International Medieval Congress in Leeds, England, and the International Saga Conference, which was in Helsinki, Finland, in 2022, about mythological and literary material. So I've spent quite a lot of time with this material. Overall, I've been studying the Vikings for about 7 years now, and so we're going to bring some of that to you. My goals for today basically are to, in some way, begin to address a disconnect I've observed over the years. Books like this one are fabulous reads, highly recommend them, but they present a version of the mythology that's a little bit more coherent than what scholarship these days tends to understand it. So I think most people really only know it from books like these. And so I'm going to bring a little bit of that scholarly perspective, including some really new research, like less than a year old research, that kind of radically changes our understanding of how the stories relate to what people actually believed 1,000 years ago. Part of that, of course, is that there's going to be dealing with some misconceptions. I think inevitably, as you start interacting with the public and with this material, there's a lot of ideas that show up over the years. And so throughout the talk, there's going to be a few of these. If you've heard about these, no shame in that. But there are some interesting things, some obvious, some not so obvious. So to use an example courtesy of our good friends over at Marvel Comics, in the Marvel universe, Loki and Thor are brothers. This has seeped into much more purportedly historical retellings of these myths as well. It's just not true, though. Thor and Loki in the mythology are in no way, shape, or form related. In fact, Loki is only tenuously related to any other gods in the mythology. One of the names for him is the one who is not one of the gods, but is counted among them. The relationship, as can be best described, is sort of a sworn brothership between him and Odin that we're told about in one poem known as Lokasenna, which is going to come up again a bit later. So, before we dive into a brief overview of some of the gods and the myths themselves, I wanted to talk about what our sources actually are for this period. Because as you're reading some of these, it's really unclear where this information comes from. So you end up with some really nice, beautiful charts, really nice, beautiful images about who all these gods are, what they all are, something perhaps like this, where we get this nice map of the whole universe of Norse myth. That blends a whole lot of different sources. So we can overall divide it into 4 main groups. We'll talk in more detail about some specifics within these groups in a little bit, but in general, we have writings produced by the descendants of the Vikings. The Vikings themselves were not a particularly literarily inclined culture. They did write things down on runestones, but the longest inscription we have is about 200 words long. So after Christianity is introduced to Scandinavia and writing and the Latin alphabet are introduced, there's this explosion of literary production in sagas, genealogies, legal treatises, and mythological texts codifying poems and other sorts of sources. We also have writings from outside of Scandinavia, which are much more often contemporary to the Vikings, but are written by their victims. So we have sources from England, France, Germany, and from Arabic travelers who went to the Vikings in the 900s that all give us little snippets of what the belief systems of these people might have been like. They also don't know what these beliefs are, though. They're not part of that culture, and so there are some problems that show up. One Arabic source that traveled to the town of Schleswig, Ibrahim al-Tartushi, describes them as fire worshippers. So he's probably basing his descriptions on Zoroastrians, who are notably not close to Scandinavia in any way, shape, or form. Then we get into the really interesting, difficult to deal with stuff. Runestones and other visual sources. So starting around the mid-700s in Sweden, we start getting these pictorial stones. We'll see one of them in a couple slides that show things that we can identify from our written material as mythological scenes. They also show a lot of things that we can't identify from the written material, which is deeply frustrating for all of us who like knowing what's going on, but offers a lot of really tantalizing insights into what might be happening. Then we have archaeology, which we'll see some examples of finds later, but these truly anything goes as we start digging stuff out of the ground. So let's talk about a few sources in particular. The first and most important one, the one that pretty much every retelling draws on, is the Prose Edda. This is written around the 1220s. We don't know exactly which year, but we do know by who. It's by the Icelandic politician Snorri Sturluson. This guy was extremely arrogant, and so what seems to have happened is in the 1210s, he traveled to the Norwegian court and swore fealty to the king in Norway. While he was there, he heard some of the Norwegian court poets and decided they were all bad at their jobs. And so sometime between 1220 and 1225, he created a poetry manual, and it is explicitly framed as a poetry manual. We know that as the Prose Edda. This is split into 4 parts. There's a prologue that's added probably 100 years later. Then there's the 3 parts that Snorri actually wrote. Gylfaginning, which is a definitive edition of Norse mythology. So this Swedish king named Gylfi goes to Asgard on accident, meets with Odin, and also Odin. He's in 3 different forms for some reason, and in a form of question and answer goes through the entire history of the world. Then there's Skáldskaparmál, which is the speech of poets, which is just a list of different names that you can use with examples of good poetry written by other people. The last part, which no one ever translates, is called Háttatal, which is a list of poetic meters. Like, this is where the poetry treaty side of it really comes in. So Snorri writes original compositions to illustrate the different poetic meters that court poets, 200 years after the conversion to Christianity, are still using to create poems that reference the gods. It's extremely interesting, but it's also a source that has some weirdness. One of the easiest points of weirdness to identify is that he makes the gods Greeks or Trojans. So quite explicitly, he says that Loki is Ulysses, Thor is Hector, and Vidar, Odin's son and heir, is Aeneas. It's very weird. We can for the most part, just kind of disregard these as interpolations that don't really affect the story quality or the research value of this source. But it is fun to point out when that there's whole sections that are just really off the rails in this source. Most scholars, though, prefer the Poetic Edda, the other main source. If it weren't for these two, we would lose about 85% of everything we know about Norse mythology. The Poetic Edda is a collection of poems written anywhere from about 900 to 1100 that were then put together in Iceland and were circulating in various forms throughout the following century. We only have one manuscript of this source written about 1270 to 1280, but it is super important. There's about 32 poems in the Poetic Edda that tell of the gods. Thor's wedding to the giant Thrymr is only found there. This scene of Thor fishing up the Midgard serpent is primarily found in that poem. The entire history of the world, the poem of Völuspá, is found here and in one other manuscript. And then the back half of the poem deals extensively with Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, with a series of about 15 poems that are just telling that story. This is an example, by the way, of one of those picture stones. The guy up top with the perfectly round head and the most perfect expression is Thor. And we can identify it through some details, the foot going through the boat, the hammer, and the ox head that you can barely see on the middle right side of the runestone as this poem Hymiskviða, where Thor fishes up the Midgard serpent and maybe kills it long before Ragnarok. Moving on to some of our other sources, our archaeological finds are, these days, just spectacular. We have about 200 years of archaeological records, from burials to building foundations in Scandinavia, and so the quantity of finds we have found is just incredible. I've got a couple of examples here with the reconstructed hall at Damalyra, an amulet that potentially depicts Loki, which would be our oldest attestation of Loki, period, from Vian, and some Mjolnir pendants, Thor's hammer pendants, from the Swedish National Museum. These finds are incredible, but in some ways really disrupt what these written sources tell us. More on that near the end of this talk. So, now that we know kind of where our information comes from, let's do a brief dive into some of the figures and stories of the myths. So, the poem Völuspá, which I mentioned earlier, gives an entire history of the Norse world from its creation to its destruction. And the Snorri in the Prose Edda clearly had access to it. He quotes about 2/3 of the poem in the text. So he's just elaborating on this one. So we start with the creation. So in the beginning, supposedly there are two realms. The realm of ice, Niflheim, and the realm of fire, Muspelheim. When these come together, the sparks of mist and fire create life in the form of the giant Ymir. Lots of things happen, but eventually the gods Odin and his older brothers, Vili and Ve, are born, and they decide that they want to create the world. So they kill Ymir and drown all of his descendants in the bloodbath that ensues, and from all the remaining bits, create the world as we understand it. After this, the gods sort of hang out for a while. It's a very pleasant time. They're playing chess with golden chess pieces. They don't have to do anything. It's supposedly very good. Until some other people who also exist, I guess, show up and they have a war about it. This is the Aesir-Vanir War, and the Vanir win this war. Odin, Thor, the other gods just lose. But it's close enough that they create a peace treaty where some of the Vanir, Njörður, Freyr, and Freya, join the Aesir and become counted among them. Meanwhile, Kvasir and Mimir, two of the Aesir, will go join the Vanir. This is a kind of bum deal for the Vanir. Odin tricks them a little bit, and so they kill Mimir and Odin preserves his head in garlic and other preservative herbs, and consults with it in times of need. Then there's this period of just adventures happening. Of the mythological poems, the first major phase seems to occur at that point in the timeline. So this is probably where Odin being kidnapped and the loss of the golden apples, Thor's travels to Utgarður and his fight with the shapeshifter Utgarðaloki, his fight with the giant Hrungnir. All of these stories seem to occur at this point in the timeline. Then this age of adventure and construction and expansion is brought to an end with the death of Baldur, depicted here in a 17th century Icelandic manuscript. So Baldur was impervious to all damage. His mother Frigg made everything in the world swear an oath that they would not hurt Baldur under any reason, except she forgot to ask the plant mistletoe. And so Loki thought it would be really funny to make a spear out of mistletoe and give it to Baldur's blind brother. Not knowing what he had, Höður, the blind god, throws it at Baldur and immediately kills him. Baldur is the first god to die and sort of marks the end of happiness. Why this is done is really unclear, but one common explanation is that Loki does this as revenge for the binding of his son Fenrir. Now, to be fair, the gods kind of needed to do that because Fenrir is prophesied to eat Odin at the end of days. So they were understandably a little bit worried about the rapidly growing giant wolf. Eventually Loki confesses to Baldur's death though, and is captured and bound to a rock where a snake will drip poison onto him for eternity. Or at least until Ragnarok. See, at Ragnarok, all of the enemies of the gods will break free. Loki will be loosed from his chains. Fenrir will break the unbreakable chain Fensalir, and it will be bad news for everyone. All the giants that the gods have been fighting will go marching on Asgard, and everyone will kill everyone else. Fenrir will kill Odin, and then proceed to get killed by Odin's son Vidar. Thor and the Midgard serpent will kill each other. Freyr and Surtur will kill each other. Heimdall and Loki will kill each other. You're noticing a trend in this. Freya does not appear in this story. But despite everything, not quite everything in the world gets destroyed. Two people, Leif and Leifthrassir, or Life and Life's husband, will hide inside a hole in the tree Yggdrasil, and several gods, Vidar and Vauli, Thor's sons Magni and MoDA, and Baldur and Höður, returned from the dead, will return and proceed to rule over this second age of people, which just continues. You'll often hear that the Norse mythology is cyclical if you're around too many online or YouTube educational spaces like I am. This is not true. Merely the end of days does not destroy everything. There is another misconception though. I pulled it up in this book, but pretty much every retelling has something similar to this diagram, where we have a nice neat list of what the 9 worlds of Norse mythology are. See, several sources say that there are 9 worlds, but what those 9 worlds are is a little bit ambiguous. So, Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology makes it all nice and easy for us. We have Asgard, where the home of the Aesir. Alfheim, where the Light Elves live. Nidavellir, which is also called Svartalfheim, where the dwarves live beneath the mountains. Midgard, the world of women and men. Jotunheim, where the frost giants and mountain giants wander and live. Vanaheim, where the Vanir live. Niflheim, the dark mist world. Muspelheim, the world of flame where Surtur waits. And Hell, where the dead who did not die bravely in battle go. Just one problem. Nowhere in the entire corpus lists these 9 worlds. And in fact, none of them, no source that says there are 9 worlds lists any of them. We cobbled this together from several other places. Some are pretty easy, right? Midgard, Asgard, almost definitely. Niflheim probably is an expansion of Hell, but as we dig in, things get really confusing. See, in the Prose Edda, Alfheim is a neighborhood in Asgard. It's just like the southern region of Asgard is called Alfheim. Svartalfheim is only attested in the Prose Edda and nowhere else, so none of our old poems have it. Vanaheim is mentioned in one old poem, but nowhere else. Hel is thrown into Niflheim, so Hel is the realm Hel part of Niflheim? Probably. So the more you start looking, the more difficult. Oh, and Nidavellir. In the same line of the only attestation of the word Nidavellir, there is another place named. For whatever reason, we decided that it's called Okrarir, I believe, as two different homes for different families of dwarves. So yeah, why we decided these 9 are the 9? Frankly, I couldn't tell you. It is really just a bit of scholarly decision-making 150 years ago that stuck, that isn't grounded very well in our actual sources. Okay, so having now thoroughly confused everyone, let's talk about some of the gods. First up is Odin. Odin is the ruler of the gods, and in fact, as long as we have written sources about the German peoples, it seems to imply that Odin is the chief of the gods. Our oldest source that is written down, not archaeological, is a 1st century Roman description of the tribes of southern Germany by a person named Tacitus, and he says that Mercury is the chief god of the Swabians. Many later sources all sort of agree, Mercury is Odin, and we don't really see a reason to dispute this. The name Wotan, the German equivalent, is attested in runestones from that part of Germany. So, for at least some people, Odin is the chief of the gods. More on that in a bit. He's also far and away the most likely to have a nickname. There is a poem that's name is just the names of Odin. You just need an entire rhyming poem to list these. To pick a few of them, he is the Allfather, he is Báleir, the one with the baleful eye, Bulverker, the worker of evil deeds, Gautatyr, the god of the people of southern Sweden, Hangatyr, the hanged god, Valtyr, the slain god, Hrafnatyr, the god of ravens, Igur, the mad one, and Sigtyr, the god of victory. So that's about 15% of all the names attested for Odin. There are so many. He's characterized consistently throughout the material as extremely knowledge hungry, going to extreme lengths in the pursuit, especially of information about the future. So he plucks out his eye and gives it to the persons who had he saved, Mimir, in order to have a sip from the well of knowledge. He hanged himself for 9 nights and 9 days to gain the power of 18 magical spells. He raises multiple people from the dead just to ask them questions. Really goes to almost any extreme length to do this. He also is a magician, which is really strange. Most kings are not magicians, and in fact, magic users were generally frowned upon in Scandinavian society. So the fact that the head honcho god is a magic user is kind of weird. He's a difficult god to pin down because in the traditional sort of taxonomy of gods, he's not a sky god, he's a warrior god, he's a giver of gifts, he's a king, but he's also a trickster. So he seems to fit a bunch of different holes in our traditional taxonomy of what the gods should be, and that has led to a lot of scholarly arguments about him. Our next one, though, is Thor. Thor is another one who is a god of very, very many things. A German source from the early 11th century, Adam of Bremen's description of the Temple of Uppsala, says that Thor is prayed to for good rains and good harvests, so perhaps he's a harvest god. In the Prose and Poetic Edda, his primary job is hitting things very hard with a hammer, so maybe a battle god? He's also in one source said that you pray to him during storms at sea. So perhaps some sort of storm or safety or protective god. Regardless, he is far and away the most likely to get into a fight. This is his primary job in the mythological stories, is that there is a problem, you solve that problem with violence, and Thor is the person you turn to when you need to, there's a troll-shaped problem, and you have a hammer. So he kills 30-something giants in the mythological stories that survive, so usually it's sort of the get-out-of-jail-free card when all else fails. He is also Odin's son, and this actually causes some very funny things in our source material. There's a 10th century English sermon by a man named Alfred that says, the god, among the Danes, the most popular god is Jupiter. That is, they call him Thor, but we know he's Jupiter because there is only one paganism and it is what the Romans believed. But these Danes are very bad at it because we know from very reliable sources that Mercury is Jupiter's son. But these Danes, they believe that Mercury that is Odin, is Jupiter's father. Therefore, we know that they are extremely far away from the light of God and good grace, and we should have no problem killing them. The sermon is called On False Gods. It's about as polemical as you would expect. Our archaeological record, though, says that Thor is far and away probably the most popular god. If you have to pick one god to pray to for anything, it's Thor. And one way they did that is through these pendants. One of my friends, Catherine Beard, created this database which has 326 Thor's hammer pendants. That's all of them that have been found or cataloged in museum records all across the world. We have over 300 of these hammers going from the early 700s to about 1100, indicating incredible popularity, especially in burials of this sort of protective amulet. Now here we get into a bit of a weird misconception. See, Thor is typically said to be a god of thunder. Now this makes sense. Thor's name, when you translate to German, is Donner, which literally means thunder. And his hammer, Mjolnir, is related to a very, very ancient word for lightning. However, recent scholarship indicates that by the Viking Age, and certainly by the time our sources get written down, he is no longer a thunder god. This is Dr. Declan Teigert's work, a fabulous book called How Thor Lost His Thunder. But basically, what happened is, round about in the 800s, as Iceland begins to get besettled, and remember, all of our sources are Icelandic, they run into a small problem. There is no lightning in Iceland. It is literally too far north to get thunderstorms. And so, you have to sort of reinterpret any sort of storm aspect about Thor. And so he seems, especially in these Icelandic sources, to gain earthquake associations. Because lightning's rare, but earthquakes are very common. So in addition to all of these other things, like there seems to be more general weather than specifically lightning, and in Iceland specifically, and therefore in the prose and the poetic Edda, earthquakes rather than lightning. The next god we're going to talk about is Freya. Now Freya is a fascinating goddess because she is often associated as just sort of a fertility being, but there's another one of these gods who defies all attempts to categorize her. Her primary association is with the form of magic or prophecy known as Saber, which is potentially what's happening in this amulet here from the National Museum of Denmark. She is the twin sister to Freyr and the daughter of Njörður, making her the queen of the Vanir, and is extremely important in a couple of stories. In addition to a hawk's form connecting her to warriors and the Valkyries, the poem Grimnismal tells us that she chooses the first half of the slain each day to go to her hall in Folklander. Odin, in Valhalla, gets the leftovers. It's hard to pin her down much more than that because she is absent from several very critical sources, most notably every story about Ragnarok. We don't know what happens to her at the end of all things. She just disappears. But we do know from the prose Edda that she's a cat person. She is pulled drives a chariot pulled by cats, and so rocks up to Baldur's funeral in that. Unfortunately, the cats are never named. Last up, we have Loki, who is a problem. He's a problem for a lot of reasons. Within the stories, he's usually the cause of most bad things, either getting the gods into bad deals, betraying them to the giants, coming up with harebrained schemes, or killing people that he really shouldn't kill. He usually fixes those problems, usually, but his thing he seems most central to is the killer of Baldur. Like, as far as everything goes, the oldest story he's in appears to be Baldur's death. He kills a lot of other people too, but Baldur is the important one. He's just so difficult to deal with. For how important he is in modern conceptions, how many stories about Thor and Loki or Odin and Loki there are, we cannot pin him down to much older than the 900s. Already in 1933, there were books dedicated to just trying to figure out what the heck Loki is doing. And there's about 15 different explanations, and there is no consensus. Loki is just sort of shows up one day into the pantheon, and there's no evidence of him being worshipped. In the entirety of Scandinavia, there are no place names about him. There are no artifacts that we can responsibly identify as definitely being Loki. There's a couple that are tempting, but none that we can really definitively just point to. And yeah, he just kind of shows up and then becomes extremely important extremely quickly. I will leave Loki as a shrug because I don't know how to deal with him either. But one of the stories Loki's in is the poem Lokasena, where he basically sits down at a party of all of the gods and proceeds to insult all of them until he has no friends left. And then he gets captured by Thor and then tied to a rock. And then they drop a serpent on top of him so that it drops venom into his eyes for eternity. Don't crash parties. But throughout a lot of this, I've been implying a lot about, this taxonomy of how pantheons of gods should work. I just have one small confession. Yeah. If we are talking about the beliefs of the Vikings as they existed 1,000 years ago, that's not how this works. So this entire premise that these books are based on, and that show up in the Prose Edda specifically, really just doesn't hold water as we start bringing in other sources of evidence. So instead, what seems to be going on the ground, and this is like really new, Terry Gunnell is one of the main people who has been promoting this and keeps getting more radical with it every time I look. So there's a talk he gave about a year ago where he actually proposed that most communities were almost monotheistic because they just picked their god, and it was the god of that community, and that was the only god they worshipped. I think this is probably a touch too far, but instead, if we combine Dr. Gunnell's work with the work of folks like Dr. Alman Jakobsen and John Lindo, what we see is that most communities only worshipped one main god, maybe a small nexus of gods. So like Freyr, Njörður, and Ullr tend to show up near each other. So there may be like a community trio. Communities might just worship Thor, they might just worship Odin. It's really hard to pin down at that level of granularity, but as far as we can, that seems to be what's going on. In addition to this, they have a mix of ancestral spirits, sub-deific beings that we can just categorize as elves, etc. More particularly, Odin's significance seems to be tied to the rise of the kingdoms of Scandinavia. So he seems to be around for a really long time, but not necessarily important. The same source I mentioned earlier, Adam of Bremen's description of the Temple of Uppsala, says that the people at Uppsala worship three gods. The third is Odin, that is to say Fury, who they pray to for success in battle. Second is Friko, who is usually interpreted as Freyr, who they pray for peace and goodwill in all things. this does mean fertility and sex. And then lastly, chief of the gods is Thor. And then we look at Alfred, who says that Odin is the chief king of the gods, even though Thor is the most popular. And it's like, okay, there's clearly some variation going on. So, as far as we can tell, based on place names and where we're finding artifacts that look like Odin, he's limited to these royal centers. In Sweden, Uppsala, in Norway, Oslo, and in Denmark, Jylland, and a little bit in Sjælland. But like central Jutland seems to be the spot where we have the highest concentration of Odin-y stuff in all of Scandinavia. So that suggests that these are the power centers of the kings of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark as those kingdoms begin to form in the 900s. So Odin, being this king god who has extraordinary license and control over the future, over knowledge, and over the slain warriors, that they're trying to tie themselves to him near the end of the pagan period as a way to create their own legitimacy and enforce, in many ways, a new religion on the peoples of Scandinavia. In general, our sources are of course tied to these. All of the poems in the Poetic Edda are composed in the Norwegian royal court or its outposts, or Iceland. And so what we seem to see is that the mythology is an invention of the last decades of the Viking Age. After, the great Viking raids of the 800s, after Christianity makes inroads, after so much of what we think of as the Viking phenomenon has already ended, that's when the mythology shows up. And then it proceeds to codify itself in the Christian period over the next 200 years. And now we can talk more specifically about some of the problems in our sources. Specifically, the fact that they're all pretty late. So this big cosmological poem, Völuspá, has actually been really reliably dated within the last couple of years to between 975 and 995. We know this does some interesting things because, like, Ragnarok is a volcanic eruption, which means it had to post-date the settlement of Iceland. So at that point, we're already halfway through the Viking Age, which starts around 750, and Iceland settled around 870. So we already don't know what Ragnarok looks like for a good chunk of this period. And we also don't know what's going on in Denmark very well. Like, we have a Danish source from around 1200. Unfortunately, he cites Icelanders. So, and he specifically says Icelanders are the best people to talk to if you want to hear about this stuff. They have the best memories. So yeah, Iceland and Norway are wildly overrepresented in our mythological record. Denmark especially often appears to be doing something a little bit different. And they're influenced by Roman models. This influence goes back an extremely long time. The National Museum in Denmark takes a pretty radical approach, actually, saying the formation of the gods themselves in between 400 and 800 is influenced by contacts with late Roman sources. I think that in some ways is a little extreme, but certainly the Prose Edda and its attempts to elaborate on the pantheon are influenced by Roman models. Alfred and in his polemic, and Adam of Bremen in his history are influenced by Roman models, and scholars were influenced by Roman models. This whole pantheon taxonomy of the king, the trickster, the war god, all of that stuff is postulated really most effectively by a man named George Dumézil in the 40s. And yeah, he uses Roman mythology to construct it and then shoehorns everyone else into that. So that's why we've been having a problem trying to taxonomize these gods, is because that's simply not how this works. That's not who the gods ever were. And it was just scholars trying to fit a bad theoretical model onto the reality on the ground this whole time. And of course, a lot of these are difficult to interpret, right? runestones and artifacts, like let's go all the way back here to some of these artifacts, like a face kind of on an amulet found by a metal detectorist, I believe, for this one, it's so hard to interpret. The only thing that makes anyone think that might possibly be Loki are the slits around the mouth, which brings to mind the myth where Loki's lips get shown shut. So, like, we're really working very scant materials in order to figure this all out and to make the archaeological record make sense. As we start taking the archaeology on its own terms, it tends to indicate a more diffuse, more multifaceted, more locally centered practice of belief. So, now that I've basically said, well, these are entertaining, these really don't tell us about Viking religion in any way, shape, or form, where do we get good information? If you want to get translations of the Prose and Poetic Edda, I seriously do recommend them. You can read the Prose Edda in an afternoon pretty comfortably, and that is 70% of all the information we have on the mythology right there. I prefer Anthony Fox's translation for the Prose Edda and Caroline Larrington's for the Poetic, but any translation published by a scholar more recently than 1990 will be fine. I also recommend checking out the Viking Society for Northern Research. They have a lot of totally free, openly available translations of a lot of sources. So a great spot if you're looking to dip your toes in a little bit farther into some of the broader textual record for what's going on. You can also check out academia.edu. Some scholars in this field are very good about uploading everything they write. Terry Gunnell and Armin Jakobsen are two examples where they have like 50 or 60 papers each. Actually, Armin has like 200, but they're mostly in Icelandic, so that's not helpful to most people. But just fabulous resources to see what are scholars currently saying, and how do they approach pulling this incredibly loose, disparate net of evidence into sometimes very radical explanations. Lastly, here's just a small number of the sources I consulted for this talk, some of the primary sources up top, and then a couple of the other things throughout. This one, the Pre-Christian Religions of the North, series is 7 volumes long, and each volume is about that thick. So I don't recommend doing that unless you have $1,000 to spend. But it is the largest study on this subject done in a century. So it really represents a lot of the ongoing trends and the way we understand religion in addition to mythology. All right, so that does it for this. So thank you all very much for listening. If you have questions now, I'm happy to take them.
Just go back to the top of the page.
Yes.
So I started out with absolutely no knowledge of this area. I have some knowledge of biblical theology. Have you thought about it all that there's some sort of similarity between Odin and Thor and El and Yahweh?
Yeah, ooh, that's an interesting one. I think, right, it's so difficult to try and postulate or sort of do biblical comparison because so many of our sources are already writing in a Christian milieu. Right, Snorri Sturluson was a devout Christian in addition to being, a poet working with pagan material and a politician who single-handedly threw Iceland into chaos. He was complicated. But what we see in a lot of these sources is they are trying to be really careful about how they're using these pagan gods because they're really afraid of trying to say that this pagan belief was in any way connected to the true religion as these medieval Christian people understood it. So they end up comparing just about everyone in the pantheon except Loki to various demons. So Thor is the big one here. You need a demon, they'll stick Thor in there, it'll work great. But Odin and Freya also get very frequently associated with either succubi or various demons, sorcerers, ancient enemies of God. And so there's a really strong oppositional relationship that's formed. If we are just trying to strip all that away and look at how it was, 1,100, 1,200 years ago, I think we simply don't know enough of how that relationship worked to really do a strong comparison one way or the other. But certainly the idea of these very localized gods that then get increasingly important and increasingly large spread and increasingly large claims about them for the emergence of like Canaanite religion out of earlier Hittite and Levantine systems. I think there's a lot of structural similarities in how that ritual works.
Yeah, I was just to press you a little further. It seems I'm really speaking of pre-Christian Judaism, where you get El as the sky god and Yahweh as a tribal god, and at some point Yahweh replaces El.
Yeah.
And you suggested that in some places Thor either replaced or was there alone without Odin. Is that kind of?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good structural similarities in how the relationship of storytelling, narrativization, and mythology to practice on the ground and how that can evolve, sometimes extremely dramatically, I think is a very good comparison point. Because I think even setting aside any specifics of X god or Y god comparison point, the underlying human structures of belief and how belief evolves, I think ends up being very cross-culturally applicable. Yeah?
In various areas in Denmark were particular gods more emphasized. I know you said in the centers, but what about rural areas? I mean, were there pockets?
Yeah, it's hard to say. We have the worst data out of all the Scandinavian countries. We have the worst data on Denmark for place names associated with gods. We have a lot of finds, but we have a lot of metal detector finds, which are very frustrating because they're so important, but also you can't really find a lot of context for them or create a larger ritual site when someone just calls you up and says, hey, I found an amulet in the ground. But one god that does seem to be pretty well attested is Njordr, who's a god that really doesn't show up in any of the stories in any prominent way. But we have sources going back a very long way, talking of sort of ritual sites on the coast to N.F.S, or which after you use some sound changes turns into Njordr. And so, especially in some smaller fishing communities in the coasts of Jutland and Sjælland, that seems to be one god that shows up relatively regularly. Tyr, there's a few place names that might be associated with Tyr, but otherwise there's another god that doesn't show up anywhere. So it's unfortunately so hard to pin down in Denmark specifically. Sweden and Iceland we have much better information for. Yeah. Perfect. So if there are no other questions, I just want to thank everyone one more time. If you are watching the recording, thank you very much.